My aunt tried to convince my parents that I was going to steal their money in the future. She said, "You need to protect yourselves." I showed them her history of financial manipulation. Now she's out of their lives for good. My aunt tried to convince my parents I'd steal their money. This is a long story, but it's been eating at me for months, and I need to get it out. I've been dealing with a manipulative family member who nearly ruined my relationship with my parents. Things blew up in a way I never expected, and there's no going back now. I'm Rowan, early 30s, living in Pennsylvania. I've been independent since I was a teenager. I moved out after high school, put myself through college, and have been working in IT ever since. My parents, Elias and Marta, are in their late 60s, retired, and living in the same house I grew up in. We've always been close, even though I don't live near them. We talk regularly, I visit when I can, and I don't rely on them financially at all. Then there's my dad's sister, Dolores. She's in her early 70s and has always been the drama magnet in our family. Dolores has this way of making every situation about herself, whether it's a birthday party, a funeral, or a family vacation. She thrives on stirring the pot, and she's always got a sob story or some crisis she's created for herself. Despite her constant chaos, she's managed to maintain a close relationship with my parents over the years. I've kept her at arm's length because I know how she operates. She's manipulative, controlling, and obsessed with money. A couple of months ago, Dolores started visiting my parents more often than usual. I didn't think much of it at first. She lives about 30 minutes away from them, and I figured maybe she was just bored or lonely. But then my mom called me one evening and asked a question that completely blindsided me. "Rowan," she said, "are you having money problems?" I was confused. "No, why would you ask that?" She hesitated. "Well, Dolores said you've been asking a lot of questions about our finances lately. She said you might be worried about your future." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I hadn't asked my parents anything about their finances. I told my mom that, and she believed me, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. Dolores had planted a seed, and it was already starting to grow. I asked my mom what else Dolores had said. Apparently, she told my parents they needed to protect themselves, because I might try to take advantage of them as they got older. She claimed she was just looking out for them and didn't want to see them get hurt. When I hung up the phone, I was furious. Dolores had crossed a line. I've worked hard to be independent, and I've never given my parents any reason to doubt me. But now, thanks to Dolores, they were second-guessing me. I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. I started digging into Dolores' history with my family. I knew she'd always been a bit of a meddler, but I didn't realize just how far she'd gone over the years. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. When my grandmother passed away 15 years ago, Dolores was the one who helped her rewrite her will. She convinced my grandmother to leave the majority of her estate to Dolores, cutting out 2 other siblings entirely. Those siblings were too heartbroken to fight it, but everyone knew Dolores had manipulated the situation. Then there was my great-uncle Harold. He was an older, single man with no kids, and Dolores practically moved into his house during the last few years of his life. She claimed she was taking care of him, but she also took control of his bank accounts. By the time he passed, his savings had mysteriously disappeared, and Dolores was driving a brand new car. I also found out about several loans she'd given to family members over the years. But these weren't ordinary loans. Dolores would swoop in when someone was struggling, offer them money, and then hold it over their heads forever. She'd use it as leverage to get what she wanted, whether it was a favor, a vote in a family dispute, or just the satisfaction of knowing she had power over them. Once I had all this information, I started putting it together into a file. I tracked down old bank statements, court documents, and emails. I even got some of my cousins to share their stories about how Dolores had manipulated them in the past. One of my cousins, Nora, told me about how Dolores convinced her to sign over the deed to her car years ago, promising to take care of it while Nora was going through a divorce. Dolores sold the car and kept the money. Another cousin, Jude, told me Dolores had borrowed $10,000 from him to pay off credit card debt. She never paid him back, and when he asked for the money, she acted like he was being selfish and ungrateful. She even tried to turn other family members against him, saying he was harassing her. By the time I was done, I had a mountain of evidence showing exactly who Dolores was and what she was capable of. But I didn't just want my parents to see it, I wanted everyone to know the truth. I decided to confront Dolores, but not directly. I knew if I went to her first, she'd deny everything and try to twist the story. Instead, I planned a family meeting. I told my parents I wanted to have an open conversation about finances, and I asked them to invite Dolores and a few other relatives. My parents agreed, thinking it was just a chance for everyone to get on the same page. When the day of the meeting arrived, Dolores showed up with her usual air of self-importance. She acted like she was doing everyone a favor by being there. My parents looked nervous, but they trusted me. The rest of the family was curious about what was going on. I started by addressing my parents directly. I told them I loved them and respected them, and that I would never, ever try to take advantage of them. Then I turned to the rest of the family and said, but there's someone in this room who can't say the same. That's when I pulled out my file. I laid out everything for everyone to see. I started by showing the documents and telling the story of my grandmother's will. I explained how Dolores convinced her to cut out her other kids and leave almost everything to Dolores. I could see the shock on my parents' faces. They had no idea the full extent of what had happened back then. Then, I moved on to my great-uncle Harold. I showed copies of his bank statements from the months before he passed, where large withdrawals were made that couldn't be accounted for. I also showed pictures of the new car Dolores had bought right after his death. I explained how she'd claimed to be taking care of him, but what she really did was drain his savings. As I kept going, Dolores started to panic. She tried to interrupt me, saying, "That's not true, and you don't know what you're talking about." But I didn't stop. I stayed calm and stuck to the facts. Every time she denied something, I pulled out more proof. Next, I shared the stories from my cousins. Nora and Jude both spoke up, confirming what Dolores had done to them. Nora even had the original paperwork from when Dolores sold her car. Jude showed emails where Dolores had promised to pay him back but never did. By this point, Dolores was red-faced and shaking. She kept trying to defend herself, but no one was listening anymore. My parents looked heartbroken. My dad, who had always defended his sister, just sat there in silence, staring at the floor. When I finished going through everything, I turned to Dolores and said, "You tried to make my parents think I was the one who would hurt them. But the truth is, you've been manipulating and stealing from this family for years. You're the one they need to protect themselves from." Dolores stood up and started yelling. She accused me of lying, of trying to turn the family against her, of being jealous of her relationship with my parents. But no one believed her anymore. The evidence was too strong. After the meeting, my parents made it clear that Dolores was no longer welcome in their lives. They blocked her number, cut off all contact, and told her to stay away from their home. My dad even called their lawyer the next day to update their will and make sure Dolores had no involvement in their estate. The rest of the family followed suit. Nora and Jude told me they were done with Dolores for good. Other relatives who had been on the fence about her finally saw her for who she really was. Dolores tried to play the victim, but no one was buying it anymore. She became a pariah in the family. But that wasn't the end of it. About a month after the meeting, I got a call from one of Dolores's former friends. Apparently, Dolores had been bragging to her about how she helped my great-uncle Harold manage his finances. She even admitted to taking some of his money, thinking it was no big deal because he didn't have kids. This friend didn't know about our family drama but thought I should know because it sounded sketchy. That's when I decided to take things a step further. I contacted an attorney and showed them everything I had on Dolores. The lawyer agreed that there was enough evidence to investigate her for financial elder abuse. I filed a formal complaint, and the case was forwarded to the authorities. It turns out, Dolores's activities with my great-uncle Harold and a few other relatives weren't just unethical, they were illegal. A few weeks later, Dolores was served with papers. She was being investigated for fraud and financial exploitation. From what I've heard, she's been scrambling to find a lawyer and figure out how to defend herself. But with all the evidence against her, it's not looking good. As for my parents, they've been doing much better since cutting Dolores out of their lives. It's like a weight has been lifted off their shoulders. They've apologized to me for ever doubting me, and our relationship is stronger than ever. I don't feel bad about what happened to Dolores. She made her bed, and now she has to lie in it. If anything, I'm glad she's finally facing the consequences of her actions. She spent her whole life taking advantage of people, and now she's the one who's losing everything. Revenge isn't always about getting even. Sometimes it's just about exposing the truth and letting the chips fall where they may. In Dolores's case, the truth was all it took to bring her world crashing down. And honestly, it feels pretty damn good. That's where things stand for now. I don't know what will happen next with the investigation, but I'll update if anything major happens. Thanks for letting me share this. Sometimes, the best revenge is just shining a light on the darkness.